Michael had always considered himself a man of discipline. For nearly a decade, he had built his career as a private tutor, shaping young minds with patience and professionalism. His marriage to Sophia, though lacking the passion of their early years, was built on mutual respect. Stability was his greatest virtue, until the day Aisha entered his life. She was his newest student, a 24-year-old African woman pursuing a business degree. The first time they met, Michael had been struck by her confidence. She carried herself with an ease that made her seem older than her years. Her deep brown eyes held a quiet intelligence, and her voice, smooth, deliberate, had a way of making every conversation feel significant. Their lessons were supposed to be straightforward: financial analysis, economic theories, market strategies. But from the very beginning, there had been something unspoken between them, a tension that neither addressed yet both felt. A shift in the air. Started subtly. Aisha would hold his gaze a second longer than necessary, the corners of her lips tilting into a knowing smile. She asked questions beyond the syllabus, about his views on life, his ambitions, his marriage. At first, Michael answered with the casual indifference of a man confident in his boundaries. But the more they talked, the more he realized how much he had forgotten what it was like to be truly seen. Sophia, his wife, was a kind woman, diligent in her career as a hospital administrator. Their conversations, however, had dwindled into exchanges about bills, schedules, and unfinished chores. The spark they once had was buried under the weight of routine. One evening, after an especially engaging session, Aisha leaned back in her chair, stretching lazily. Her fitted dress accentuated her figure, and for the first time Michael caught himself looking. He forced his gaze away, cursing himself. "You always seem lost in thought when you leave," she said, tilting her head. Michael chuckled nervously. "Just tired. Long day." Aisha studied him. "You ever wonder if you're living the life you're meant to? Or if you just settled into one because it was easier?" The question struck deeper than it should have. He hesitated before answering, his mouth suddenly dry. "I think everyone wonders that at some point." She smiled. "I don't. I know exactly what I want." Michael had no response. A dangerous invitation. The next week, their lesson ran later than usual. Outside, a summer storm had rolled in, rain hammering against the windows of Aisha's apartment. The power flickered, then went out entirely. "Well, that's unfortunate," Aisha murmured, lighting a candle from a drawer. The flame cast a warm glow on her features, making her look almost ethereal. The room was suddenly smaller, more intimate. Michael cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "I should probably head home before it gets worse." "You could," she said, her voice softer now. "Or you could stay a little longer. No rush, right?" There was nothing overtly suggestive in her words, yet the weight of them pressed against him. His pulse quickened. Aisha stood, walking to the small bookshelf across the room. As she reached for something, her dress rode up just enough to reveal a smooth expanse of skin. Michael tore his eyes away, feeling a deep sense of guilt. This wasn't him. He loved his wife. But when Aisha turned back, holding a book in her hands, her expression was knowing. She had caught him looking. And yet, instead of embarrassment, there was amusement in her gaze. She handed him the book. "You should read this sometime. It's about people who let life make choices for them instead of choosing for themselves." Michael took the book, but his hands were unsteady. He needed to leave. That night, as he lay beside Sophia in their bed, he found himself staring at the ceiling. He could still hear the rain against the windows, still see the flickering candlelight reflecting in Aisha's eyes. Sophia stirred in her sleep, shifting closer to him. Instinctively, he reached for her, but she was already turning away, lost in dreams of her own. Michael exhaled, closing his eyes. He told himself nothing had happened, but deep down he knew that wasn't true. Something had started, and he wasn't sure he could stop it. Michael had convinced himself that nothing had changed. That his moment of hesitation in Aisha's apartment had been just that. A moment. A fleeting temptation, easily dismissed. But as the days passed, he found himself more distracted than ever. His thoughts drifted to her in ways they shouldn't. The curve of her smile, the way she challenged him, the undeniable electricity between them. At home, Sophia barely noticed his distance. She was drowning in work, coming home late, too exhausted for conversation. When she did speak, it was about hospital budgets, staff shortages, or insurance policies. She never asked how he was doing. Maybe that was what unsettled him the most. Not that he was thinking about Aisha, but that Sophia never noticed. The next time he saw Aisha, she didn't mention the night of the storm. But something in her demeanor had shifted. Her glances lingered longer. Her laughter held a softness that felt more personal. And Michael? He was losing his grip on the boundaries he had so carefully maintained. The invitation. One evening, as their lesson wrapped up, Aisha leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "You always seem like you're holding back," she mused. Michael frowned. "Holding back?" She nodded. "Like there's something you want to say, but you won't let yourself." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I think you're reading too much into things." Aisha smiled knowingly. "Maybe." She paused, then added, "Do you ever do anything spontaneous, Michael?" The question caught him off guard. He had always been calculated, predictable. He followed schedules, made responsible choices. Spontaneity wasn't part of his nature. "I used to," he admitted. Aisha's eyes flickered with amusement. "Then let's change that." Before he could respond, she stood and grabbed her keys. "Come with me." Michael hesitated. This was dangerous territory, and he knew it. He should decline, pack his things, and go home to his wife. But he didn't. Instead, he found himself following Aisha out the door. The unspoken confession. She drove them to a small jazz lounge on the outskirts of the city. The air was thick with the scent of whiskey and old leather, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the room. Aisha led him to a corner booth, ordering 2 drinks before he could protest. "You're tense," she observed as she slid his glass toward him. "Relax." Michael took a slow sip, letting the warmth of the liquor settle in his chest. He shouldn't be here. He knew that. But sitting across from Aisha, watching the way the candlelight flickered in her eyes, he found himself unable to leave. For a while they just talked. Not about school or lessons, but about life. Aisha spoke of her dreams, her fears, the things that kept her awake at night. And Michael, against his better judgment, found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years. "My wife and I," he hesitated, swirling his drink. "We used to be different. Closer." Aisha didn't push, didn't pry. She simply nodded, her gaze steady. "What changed?" Michael sighed. "Life, I suppose. Work. Responsibilities. Somewhere along the way we stopped being us." Aisha reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his hand. It was the lightest of touches, yet it sent a shiver down his spine. "Maybe you're still in there," she said softly. "Maybe you just need to remember who you were." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. The first mistake. As they left the lounge, the night air was cool against Michael's skin. Aisha walked beside him, her steps unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. When they reached her car, she turned to him, leaning against the door. "You don't have to go home yet." Michael knew what she was offering. The invitation was there, unspoken but clear. His pulse pounded in his ears. This was the moment. The line between right and wrong, between caution and recklessness, had never felt thinner. Aisha tilted her head, watching him. "No pressure," she murmured. "But I think you already know what you want." Michael swallowed hard. His mind screamed at him to walk away, to get in his own car and drive home, to pretend none of this had happened. But he didn't. As he stepped closer, Aisha smiled. And just like that, the line disappeared. Michael woke before dawn, his heart pounding with the weight of what he had done. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of the city outside, shadows stretching across the walls like silent witnesses to his betrayal. Aisha lay beside him, her breathing slow and steady, her bare shoulder exposed beneath the sheets. He closed his eyes, but guilt gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. He had crossed the line. No, he had obliterated it. He had betrayed Sophia, the woman who had trusted him, who had built a life with him. And for what? A moment of weakness. A fleeting desire. Sliding out of bed carefully, he reached for his clothes, his movements slow and deliberate. He needed to leave before reality fully caught up with him. But as he buttoned his shirt, a voice, soft yet knowing, cut through the silence. "You're running." Michael turned. Aisha was awake, propped up on one elbow, watching him with an expression that was unreadable. Not regretful. Not triumphant. "I have to go," he muttered. She nodded, as if she had expected nothing else. "And then what?" Michael hesitated. "I figure things out." Aisha sighed, sitting up. "You can lie to yourself, Michael, but don't lie to me. You knew exactly what you were doing." Her words stung because they were true. The weight of silence. The drive home felt endless. Each red light, each empty street stretched time unbearably. When he finally pulled into the driveway, he sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel. Sophia's car was parked neatly beside his. She was home. She always was. As she always had been. Steeling himself, he entered the house. His senses hyper-aware of every sound. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock. The scent of lavender lingered in the air. The same scent Sophia had always favored. Then he saw her. She was at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cradled between her hands, eyes scanning over some paperwork. When she looked up, her expression was unreadable. Not tired. Not indifferent. Just watching. "You're home late," she said. Not accusing. Not angry. Just a fact. Michael forced a smile. Lost track of time after lessons. She nodded, but something in her gaze lingered on him longer than usual. He moved past her, pressing a kiss to her temple. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. The gap between them felt wider than ever. A sudden threat. Days passed. Michael buried himself in work, avoiding Aisha, avoiding unnecessary conversations with Sophia. He told himself he could move past it, that it had been a mistake, one that would never happen again. Then the message came. It was late afternoon when his phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. "Unknown, I know what you did." Michael's breath hitched. He stared at the screen, his heart hammering. Another message followed. "Unknown. Meet me at the cafe on 5th. An hour. Come alone." For a moment he considered ignoring it. But dread settled in his stomach like a stone. He had no choice. The truth revealed. The cafe was nearly empty when he arrived. He spotted the man immediately. A tall, broad-shouldered figure sitting at a corner table, arms crossed. David. Aisha's boyfriend. Michael approached cautiously, his mouth dry. David's gaze was piercing, his jaw clenched. Without a word, he gestured for Michael to sit. Michael hesitated before lowering himself into the chair. "What do you want?" David chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "What do I want? That's a funny question coming from the man who slept with my girlfriend." Michael exhaled sharply. "Listen, David held up a hand. "Spare me the excuses." He leaned in, his expression unreadable. "Tell me something, Michael. Do you think you were the first?" Michael frowned. "What are you talking about?" David smirked, shaking his head. "You really thought you were special, didn't you?" He leaned back, arms crossed. "Aisha plays games, Michael. And you? You were just another move on the board." The words hit like a slap. "She told me everything," David continued. "Not because she felt guilty. Because she wanted to see what you'd do." Michael's stomach twisted. "Why?" David's gaze darkened. "Because she enjoys it." The weight of the revelation crushed him. Aisha had never cared, never struggled with guilt. He had destroyed his marriage, his sense of self, for a woman who saw him as nothing more than an experiment. Michael swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. So what happens now? David studied him for a long moment, then stood. That's up to you. He dropped a folded piece of paper on the table. But if I were you, I'd think long and hard about what kind of man you really are. With that, he walked away. Michael stared at the paper before hesitantly unfolding it. Inside, written in Aisha's elegant script, was a single sentence. I told you not to run from this. His hands shook. He had ruined everything. And for what? Lie.